The freezing slipstream howled around Major Gale Goody Good's canopy, a sound indistinguishable from the screams of the dying men below him. It was October 14, 1943, the second massive assault on Schweinfurt, and the sun reflecting off the hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters turning toward the American formation resembled a swarm of metallic locusts. Goody was flying a P-47 Thunderbolt, arguably the toughest fighter the USAAF had yet deployed, but toughness meant nothing when distance was your enemy. They had crossed the limit. The fuel gauges were dropping faster than the stricken B-17s plummeting to the Bavarian fields below. The mission parameters were ironclad: protect the bombers to the initial point IP, and then, no matter the carnage, you turned back. Goody watched in agony as a flight of 50 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s tore into the staggered formations of flying fortresses. The B-17s, designed to defend themselves with interlocking fields of fire, were brave, beautiful targets, but without the speed and maneuverability of the American fighters, they were simply fat ducks waiting for the slaughter. The German pilots, veterans hardened over the Eastern Front, knew the drill perfectly. They waited, circling patiently like sharks, until the American escorts, the robust, short-legged Thunderbolts and the complex, maintenance-heavy Lightnings, hit their fuel maximum and reluctantly broke off the fight. Goody had watched 3 different fortresses explode into bright orange fireballs in under 90 seconds after his squadron leader gave the signal to aggress. He banked hard, the P-47's immense Pratt & Whitney engine groaning under the stress, and started the long, lonely retreat westward, leaving behind a sky filled with smoke, falling debris, and the desperate radio calls of the remaining bomber crews. This day, known forever as Black Thursday, saw 60 B-17s shot down, resulting in 600 casualties, most of them killed or captured. This catastrophic loss rate, over 25% of the attacking force, was unsustainable. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, looked at the numbers and faced a terrifying truth. Daylight strategic bombing, the core strategy meant to dismantle Hitler's war machine, was failing. The Luftwaffe had developed the perfect countertactic: endurance. They simply had to wait us out. The high-altitude daylight raids were becoming suicidal missions, and the morale of the bomber crews, once unbreakable, was cracking under the constant strain of knowing that somewhere over central Germany, their fighter support would vanish, leaving them utterly exposed. The USAAF desperately needed a weapon that could fly faster, higher, and most critically, farther, a weapon that could loiter above Berlin while the bombers finished their work, a guardian angel with devastating firepower that did not know the meaning of a fuel limit. If they didn't find it, and fast, the entire concept of knocking Germany out of the war through air power alone would be tossed onto the scrap heap, and the ground invasion, when it came, would be infinitely bloodier. The failure was not one of courage or technological inferiority in the airframe itself. It was a pure calculus of physics dictated by internal volume and engine consumption. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug, was a monster of American engineering, capable of absorbing horrific damage and hitting back with 8 terrifying .50 caliber machine guns. It was an excellent dogfighter, especially at high altitudes, thanks to its massive turbo supercharger system. But that massive engine, the R-2800 Double Wasp, was a thirsty beast, and the airframe, designed for ruggedness, prioritized armor over slender fuel efficiency. Even with the introduction of external drop tanks, an innovation that itself was initially resisted by conservative commanders who believed external tanks made the fighters vulnerable, the P-47 simply couldn't cover the crucial final leg of the journey into the heart of the Reich. Similarly, the P-38 Lightning, the sleek, twin-boomed marvel, offered better range and often operated deep into enemy territory, particularly in the Mediterranean. But the P-38 was complex. Its twin engines were maintenance nightmares in muddy English airfields, and its cooling system often struggled at extreme high altitudes, leading to operational availability rates far below what was needed to field the massed escorts required for a 1,000-plane raid. Planners were literally drawing circles on large operational maps centered on Britain, showing the absolute limit of the fighter coverage, and those circles barely scraped the surface of the vital industrial targets that needed to be hit. The gap between the maximum range of the escorts and the target zone, That deadly, empty space over places like Leipzig, Munich, and finally Berlin was where the Luftwaffe won the battle every time. The strategic implication was staggering. Without the ability to guarantee protection, the USAAF was forced to fly shorter, safer missions, constantly hitting peripheral targets that did little to disrupt German war production at its core. Hitler's ability to wage war rested on the fact that he controlled the German interior, protected by geography and the lack of Allied air reach. Eker and his staff were trapped in a technological dilemma. They needed a fighter that had the reliability and firepower of the Thunderbolt but the range of a medium bomber, an impossible combination using contemporary American engine design. Engineers frantically tried everything, reducing armor, stripping weight, and even jury-rigging additional fuel tanks inside the bomb bays of the P-38s, but nothing worked. The solution, they began to realize with growing chagrin, probably wouldn't come from an American drawing board. It would have to come from an almost accidental combination of foreign innovation and American production capacity, a marriage of components that seemed ludicrously mismatched at first glance, yet was destined to redefine air combat forever. The genesis of the aircraft that would save the 8th Air Force began not in some top-secret American hangar, but in a desperate request from the British Purchasing Commission in 1940. They approached North American Aviation, NAA, asking them to license-build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk for the Royal Air Force. NAA President James Kindleberger famously scoffed at the idea of building an outdated design, offering instead, "Give us 120 days and we will build you a better fighter." The resulting aircraft, initially dubbed the NA-73X, was revolutionary in its aerodynamic purity, utilizing a breakthrough design concept known as the laminar flow wing. This wing, remarkably smooth and highly efficient, promised incredible speed and low drag. The prototype flew in October 1940, less than 4 months after the concept was approved. The British, impressed with its handling, quickly placed orders, christening it the Mustang. However, the first versions, equipped with the American-made Allison V1710 engine, suffered from a critical, almost fatal flaw. They were fantastic at low altitudes, excelling in reconnaissance and ground attack roles, but their performance dropped off sharply above 15,000 feet. The Allison engine lacked the necessary power output from its single-stage supercharger to truly thrive in the thin, high atmosphere where the strategic bombing missions were taking place. The USAAF initially adopted a few squadrons for reconnaissance, but largely dismissed it as an escort fighter. It simply couldn't compete with the high-altitude capabilities of the P-47 or P-38. The Mustang seemed destined for mediocrity, a useful, but ultimately limited, tactical fighter relegated to the lower skies. The true transformation occurred through a moment of inspired desperation at Rolls-Royce. Engineers there, familiar with the Mustang's outstanding airframe and cognizant of the Allison's high-altitude weaknesses, had a hunch. They reasoned that if they could shoehorn their own legendary engine, the Merlin 60 series, a massive two-stage, two-speed supercharged powerhouse, into the sleek North American frame, they might unlock the Mustang's true potential. The modification was complicated, requiring significant redesign of the firewall and carburetor intake, most noticeably resulting in the distinctively high, rectangular air scoop under the fuselage. The result was instantaneous and breathtaking. When the first prototype, now known as the Mustang Mark X, flew, the RAF pilots immediately reported blistering performance. The laminar flow wing, finally mated with an engine capable of delivering optimal power at 30,000 feet, turned the decent low-altitude fighter into a high-altitude thoroughbred. The news rapidly crossed the Atlantic, and American officials, reeling from the Schweinfurt losses, realized they were looking at their Hail Mary pass. The P-51B and C variants, powered by the American-built version of the Merlin engine, the Packard V1650, were immediately rushed into production and deployment, marking the single most crucial pivot in the air war over Europe. The arrival of the P-51B and P-51C models in late 1943 was quiet, almost understated, but their effect was immediate and seismic. Unlike their stubby P-47 counterparts, the Mustang possessed an almost lyrical elegance. It was slender, fast, and aerodynamic perfection, earning it the nickname the Cadillac of the skies. But aesthetics aside, its true secret lay in its endurance. Thanks to the highly efficient Merlin engine and the massive 85-gallon self-sealing fuel tank installed directly behind the pilot, which necessitated the new, streamlined Razorback canopy design, the P-51 could carry enough internal fuel to fly almost 3 hours. When combined with two 108-gallon external drop tanks, which by this time had been successfully engineered to be jettisoned automatically once empty, the Mustang's operational radius stretched out to over 850 miles. Suddenly, Berlin was not only reachable but could be patrolled for hours. The psychological impact on the German pilots during the first deep penetration missions was immediate confusion, followed by terror. Luftwaffe tactics relied heavily on the predictability of the American escorts turning back. Their fighters would assemble, massing their forces along the expected route, knowing they had a guaranteed window of 20 to 30 minutes of uncontested slaughter. But when the American bombers flew past the traditional limit, and the fast, silver-winged fighters remained, the German air defenses were thrown into chaos. Major Gunther Röhl, one of the top German aces, later recounted the shock. "We saw these new American fighters, and we knew instantly everything had changed. They were fast, they were high, and they just kept coming. We thought they had to be out of fuel, that it must be a deception, but they stayed with the bombers all the way to the target and back. We had lost our sanctuary." The P-51 pilots, many of them transferring from the P-47 and P-38 units, felt an unprecedented sense of liberation. For the first time, they weren't just escorting, they were hunting. The bomber crews, seeing the unmistakable silhouette of the Mustang weaving high above them, experienced a renewal of hope that had been extinguished months before. The infamous dead zone was gone. Every mile of the flight path, from the English coast to the deepest German targets, was now under the shadow of the P-51's formidable protection. The winter of 1943 to 1944 became the transition period, but the moment the Luftwaffe commanders fully realized the extent of their disaster was during the massive raids on Berlin beginning in March 1944. These were no longer tentative feelers. These were overwhelming displays of air dominance, fully escorted by hundreds of P-51s. The air battle became an engagement of attrition that the Germans simply could not win. The P-51s were not just fast. They could outclimb the FW-190 at altitude and were much more maneuverable than the Me-109 above 25,000 feet, which was the preferred operating height of the bomber formations. The German strategy of boom and zoom, making one fast pass through the formation and escaping, was now met by swarms of Mustangs capable of matching their speed and running them down, often 200 miles deep into German territory. The loss rates of the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs skyrocketed. Furthermore, the P-51 pilots introduced a lethal psychological edge. Equipped with auxiliary radios, they could monitor the conversations of the German interceptors, allowing them to anticipate attack vectors and position themselves perfectly for the ambush. The skies over the Reich, once a sanctuary for the defenders, became a killing field. This period of aerial warfare was characterized by a brutal, necessary escalation, forcing airmen on both sides to confront the moral realities of total air dominance. It was necessary to defeat the enemy, but the cost was horrific, paid in young lives and shattered machines. We must pause here, in this moment of strategic victory forged in the fires of constant aerial warfare, and ask a fundamental, thought-provoking question that haunted every commander and pilot. When pursuing absolute air superiority, which allows for the destruction of the enemy's infrastructure and the inevitable reduction of friendly ground casualties, does the deliberate policy of targeting the enemy's capacity to fight, destroying their pilots, their factories, and their morale cross a necessary tactical line into simple, ruthless annihilation? How do you, watching this story, view the moral calculation required to ensure victory when that victory depends on the complete and utter removal of the enemy from the skies? Share your thoughts in the comments below, reflecting on the heavy price paid for air dominance in this merciless conflict, because the answer determines whether we see these pilots as heroes or simply instruments of overwhelming force. Regardless of the interpretation, the strategy worked. The tide had definitively turned, driven by the Mustang's merciless efficiency. The psychological and strategic shift was codified by the famously aggressive General Jimmy Doolittle, the new commander of the 8th Air Force, who issued a radical directive in early 1944 that fundamentally changed the nature of the air war. Previously, escort pilots had been strictly ordered to remain tethered to the bombers, engaging enemy fighters only when they threatened the formations. This often meant the fighters were forced into reactive positions, and German pilots could escape easily once the interception was done. Doolittle scrapped that doctrine entirely. His new order was simple and brutal. Your job is to destroy the German Air Force. If they fly, kill them. If they hide, find them and kill them. Go where the German fighters are. This was the birth of the hunter-killer doctrine. The P-51s were unleashed. They were no longer mere bodyguards. They became predators, armed with the knowledge of their superior range and high-altitude performance, especially the definitive D model with its superior visibility bubble canopy. Mustang pilots began conducting massive, deep-penetration fighter sweeps independent of the bomber streams. These raids, often called Ranger missions, focused on seeking out German fighter formations before they could even mass for an attack. Even more devastatingly, the P-51 pilots began systematic, aggressive attacks on Luftwaffe airfields. Landing and taking off were the most vulnerable moments for German aircraft, and the Mustangs exploited this ruthlessly. Pilots would sweep down, strafing runways, hangars, and refueling trucks. The sight of a P-51 squadron circling low over their home base became a crushing reality for German ground crews and pilots. The goal was no longer merely to protect the bombers. It was to eradicate the Luftwaffe as a fighting force, unit by unit, runway by runway. The P-51's speed, capable of hitting over 430 miles per hour, combined with its long loitering time, meant that German pilots rarely had a safe moment. If they scrambled, they met the Mustangs high above. If they landed to refuel, the Mustangs were waiting low. This relentless, omnipresent threat began to break the organizational back of the German fighter arm, a far more effective strategy than simply shooting down planes over the target area. The strategic initiative had passed entirely to the Americans, thanks to the Mustang's unique combination of efficiency and lethality. The culmination of this lethal new strategy occurred in February 1944, a devastating period known to history as the Big Week or Operation Argument. The goal was audacious and simple: deliver a knockout blow to German aircraft production and, more critically, force the Luftwaffe to commit its remaining fighter reserves to battle where the P-51s could destroy them. For 7 straight days, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched continuous, massive daylight raids deep into Germany, hitting key aircraft factories, particularly those producing Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt fighters. The Germans were left with no choice but to commit every available resource to interception. This was precisely the trap Doolittle intended. The skies became a massive, chaotic shooting gallery. The P-51s, flying in coordinated, disciplined sweeps ahead of and alongside the bombers, engaged the German fighters with relentless aggression. The statistics from the Big Week are staggering. Over 1,000 German aircraft were destroyed in the air and on the ground, a crippling, irreplaceable loss. While the production facilities took a heavy blow, the true strategic victory lay in the obliteration of the trained pilot cadre. Unlike the Americans, who had a deep, steady pipeline of trained pilots flowing from vast training programs in the States, the Luftwaffe was already suffering from a chronic shortage of seasoned combat aviators. Every Me-109 shot down meant the loss of a valuable machine, but every experienced pilot killed represented a gap that took thousands of flying hours and months of training to fill, resources Germany no longer possessed. The P-51 was the perfect tool for this attrition warfare, capable of catching the fastest German fighters in a dive and dogfighting the most nimble ones at high altitude. The legendary German fighter pilot Adolf Galland famously stated that when he first saw the P-51s deep inside Germany, he knew the air war was lost. The psychological blow was irreversible. The Luftwaffe High Command, desperately scrambling to find a defense, began experimenting with suicidal tactics, including heavily armored formations flying directly into the bomber streams with little regard for maneuverability, a move that only led to more massacres when the Mustangs arrived. The true genius of the P-51's operational impact was not just its ability to shoot down aircraft, but its role in destroying the German training and replacement system. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe could still produce airframes. Factories, often moved underground or dispersed, still churned out FW-190s and BF-109s at a high rate, but they had virtually no one left who knew how to fly them effectively in combat. The relentless Ranger missions and airfield strafing conducted by the P-51 groups ensured that the few training units Germany possessed were constantly harassed or destroyed. Trainee pilots, rushed through abbreviated programs due to fuel shortages and operational necessity, were thrown into the inferno of the Western Front with barely 100 hours of total flight time, often just minutes in a combat environment. Against them were pitted American P-51 pilots who typically arrived in theater with hundreds of training hours and quickly accumulated scores of combat sorties under the mentorship of seasoned squadron leaders. The result was inevitable and brutal. The life expectancy of a newly arrived German fighter pilot plummeted to a matter of weeks, sometimes days. This systematic destruction of human capital was the final, irreversible blow to the Luftwaffe. The strategic shift was profound. The Americans stopped fearing German interceptors and began actively hunting them to exhaustion. Air superiority evolved into air supremacy, and finally air dominance. This absolute control meant that Allied reconnaissance planes could fly unmolested, mapping invasion routes and target areas, and that the strategic bombing campaign could be executed with precision and devastating accuracy, knowing the bombers had a guaranteed shield. The P-51, by eliminating the veteran core of German resistance, turned the European sky into an operational theater where the Allies dictated every single move, profoundly impacting the calculations for the impending ground invasion. As the Allies prepared for the massive invasion of continental Europe, Operation Overlord, the P-51 Mustang performed its final vital service, ensuring absolute aerial silence over the beachheads. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe had been pushed almost entirely out of the day skies over France and the Low Countries. Those German units that remained were forced to fly dangerous, low-level reconnaissance missions or attempt suicidal intercept operations only in the most desperate circumstances. The P-51 became the ubiquitous symbol of Allied air control, ranging across the entire invasion area, performing fighter sweeps, interdicting supply lines, and conducting brutal cab-rank ground support for Allied troops. German panzer divisions attempting to move toward the Normandy beaches after D-Day were decimated by the relentless attacks of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The Mustang's effectiveness was so complete that, often, German troop formations would only move under the cover of deep cloud or during the night, knowing that any movement during daylight hours meant certain death from the air. This total air superiority was perhaps the most crucial factor in the rapid success of the Normandy landings. Without the constant threat of enemy air attack, Allied troop ships and landing craft could transit the channel unmolested, and crucial logistical support could be flown directly into captured airfields. The pilots, flying the bubble canopy P-51D, enjoyed unparalleled visibility, which enhanced their already deadly efficiency in both air-to-air and ground attack roles. The desperation of the German defense was highlighted by their last-ditch reliance on technological marvels, most notably the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262 was terrifyingly fast, easily leaving the P-51 behind in a straight race. However, even this formidable jet proved vulnerable to the Mustang's tenacity. P-51 pilots, wise to the jet's Achilles heel, began patrolling German airfields, attacking the Me-262s at their most vulnerable points. During the slow, delicate process of taking off or landing, the sheer numbers and persistent harassment ensured that the jets, while dangerous, could never be deployed in sufficient operational mass to regain control of the skies. By the end of the war, the P-51 Mustang had racked up more air-to-air kills than any other fighter in the European theater of operations, solidifying its place not just as an important aircraft, but as the single most decisive weapon in securing Allied air dominance. The long-range capability, which had initially been the technological gap the Germans exploited, was now the very quality that broke their war machine. It proved that strategic victory required not just firepower, but endurance and the capacity to project power anywhere, anytime. The legacy of the P-51 is intertwined with the extraordinary bravery of the 8th Air Force pilots, men like Don Gentile, John Meyer, and Chuck Yeager, who flew the Mustang to unprecedented levels of combat success, often logging 4- and 5-hour missions deep over hostile territory. Their sacrifice, combined with the technical brilliance of the Merlin engine conversion, fundamentally shortened the European war. If the Luftwaffe had maintained its dominance over the skies, the strategic bombing campaign would have failed, and D-Day would have been delayed, facing far stiffer resistance. The Mustang ensured that by the time Allied troops stepped onto Omaha and Utah beaches, the greatest threat they faced was from ground fire, not from the skies. The German Air Force was broken, crippled by a relentless campaign that targeted not just their aircraft, but their very ability to replenish and train their pilots. The P-51 Mustang was not merely a fighter. It was the instrument of strategic realization, the key that unlocked Hitler's interior fortress. It remains the shining symbol of American ingenuity married to combat necessity, a machine that turned the tide of the most complex aerial conflict in history. We can only look back at those brave bomber crews, who once flew alone into the abyss, and recognize the enduring comfort and security brought by the silver wings of the P-51 finally riding high above them, ensuring their safe passage. It was truly the secret weapon that forced the Luftwaffe to quit the fight they could no longer win. If this epic story of American dominance and aerial heroism touched your heart and gave you a deeper appreciation for the turning points of the war, please hit that like button, subscribe to WWII Lore, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the legendary machines and brave pilots who mastered the skies above Europe. Thank you for watching.